The envelope was cream-colored and thick, the kind used when the law wants to remind you it's serious. Kessler and Bright attorneys at law embossed across the front. My name sat just beneath in crisp black ink, too elegant for anything routine. I hadn't opened it yet when the phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice, cold and exact, said, "You got the letter, don't go, Delilah. Charlotte's the face of the family. She's the one Grandma chose. You weren't even working there anymore. It's not for you." I said nothing, but my eyes landed on one line printed just below the date. "You have been identified as a party with legal standing in the execution of Evelyn Moore's estate. Not invited. Identified." A difference my mother never noticed. But Grandma did. It had been 2 weeks since Grandma Evelyn passed. The morning it happened, the wind in Raleigh felt different, like something had cleared. Not lighter, just settled. My phone buzzed before I even broke the seal on the envelope. My mother's name lit up the screen. I didn't want to answer, but I did. "You got the letter, didn't you?" Her voice snapped without greeting. I looked at it in my hand. "Just now," I said. "Well, you don't need to come." She paused the way she always did before delivering a blow dressed as advice. "Charlotte is the one Grandma trusted. She's the one who deserves to be there." "Not everything is a performance, Mom," I replied, already exhausted. Her sigh was sharp. "Delilah, don't make this harder than it needs to be. It's just a formality. Don't embarrass yourself by showing up to something you were never part of." The call ended the way most of ours did. With silence. Not slamming, not shouting. Just the kind that falls between people who stopped trying to reach each other a long time ago. I turned the envelope over twice, then slid my finger under the flap. The letter inside was printed on heavy stock. Formal. Precise. The last will and testament of Evelyn L. Moore would be read on the 24th of January at 1000 a.m. in Asheville, North Carolina. Attendance was requested of all named beneficiaries. I scanned the rest quickly, already expecting the wording. But one line made me stop. "You have been identified as a party with legal interest." I ran my thumb over those words like they might smudge or disappear. Not just invited. Identified. With legal interest. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table next to my half-drunk coffee. Charlotte wouldn't have even waited to open it. She would have posted the envelope online, tagged the firm, captioned it something like "Honored, Blessed, Legacy." She'd always been that way. Loud in a way people celebrated. She was 2 years older, endlessly photogenic, and somehow always on the right side of favor. Especially with our parents. Charlotte's internship had turned into a spotlight. She'd gone from promoting brand partnerships for Moore and Wren Holdings to becoming the face of it in less than a year. Me, I'd lasted 3 years of proposal decks, operations, meetings, and quiet edits that never got acknowledged. Then one afternoon, I walked out of a boardroom and didn't go back. No one asked why, no one even noticed. The house felt cold that morning. The kind of cold that sneaks into old hardwood floors. I wrapped my cardigan tighter and looked out the window. The garden was bare now, the winter having stripped it down to its bones. I thought of Grandma Evelyn's hands. Always doing something. Kneading dough. Pulling weeds. Gently tucking lavender behind my ear when I was small. She never needed much to say everything. Sometimes we'd spend whole afternoons in her kitchen without speaking, just moving, stirring, washing. Her quiet was different from the kind I grew up with. It didn't feel like rejection. It felt like room. I'd gone to see her just 3 days before the stroke. She'd made orange zest tea and set out lemon shortbread on the little plate she only used for company. We sat under the patio heater, bundled in mismatched shawls, and watched the birds fight over the last berries on the holly bush. She didn't bring up the company. Or the past. Or Charlotte. She just said, "I always liked the way you listen." That was it. I didn't know she'd made changes to her will. She never said a word about it. But when I read that sentence in the letter, I felt something old shift again. You have been identified as a party with legal interest. Not Charlotte's sister. Not the quiet one. Not the forgotten intern. Someone with legal interest. I pressed the crease into the folded letter and slid it into the inside pocket of my coat. Then I circled the date on the calendar with a red pen even though I never used red. I wasn't going to Asheville to make a statement. I didn't expect an apology, or recognition, or inheritance. But something told me I needed to be in that room. Even if no one else thought I belonged there. I hadn't set foot inside Moore and Wren Holdings since the fall of 2018. Back then, I still believed in the idea that hard work spoke for itself. That if I kept my head down, delivered what was asked, and went a little further, someone would notice. Someone would say, "You did good." But that's not how it worked. Not there. I joined the company right after graduating from UNC Charlotte with a business degree and a quiet sort of ambition. My grandmother had built Moore and Wren from the ground up. Real estate development, small-scale investments. She'd started it in the 82nd with one partner and a borrowed desk. I thought I might continue that legacy, even if only in the background. My first role was in strategic operations, where nobody smiled unless they were in a meeting, and every email started with a bullet point. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. I loved problem-solving, building models, figuring out why something was leaking money or where a process broke. I wasn't loud, but I was effective. For a while I thought that was enough. Then Charlotte showed up. She wasn't even supposed to be interested in the business. In college, she'd studied communications, leaned heavily into branding and influencer marketing. But somehow she spun that into a role as a brand consultant for the company. At first, it seemed harmless. A few social media pushes, a photo shoot here and there. Then she got invited to an executive meeting. Then she was featured in a local business magazine as one of Raleigh's rising women in real estate, complete with a photo of her sipping a cappuccino at a corner office window that didn't belong to her. She posted the article online with a caption about carrying Grandma Evelyn's vision forward. My name wasn't mentioned. That was the beginning of the end. Meetings I used to be in suddenly moved without notice. Reports I prepared were rerouted through marketing. I asked about it once, and the VP of operations said, "It's just optics, Delilah. You're doing great work. Let us handle the face of things." The face of things. That was always Charlotte. At home, it wasn't much different. Mom praised Charlotte's energy, her confidence, her ability to connect with people. She said, "Charlotte gets it. She knows how to move with the times." I was sitting across the kitchen table when she told me that. I still remember the way her fork clinked against the side of her plate. "And you, sweetie, well, maybe this company just isn't your thing. You're more background, more supportive. Like a couch pillow," I wanted to say. Pretty enough to keep around, but no one notices unless it's gone. I didn't say it. I just smiled the way I was taught to and nodded. That week I packed up my cubicle and turned in my resignation letter. No one tried to stop me. Not even Charlotte. The official reason I gave was personal growth. The real reason was quiet erasure. Grandma Evelyn never asked why I left. But the next time I visited, she handed me a book of poetry by Mary Oliver and said, "I thought this one was yours." I didn't understand what she meant until months later. That was 5 years ago. Since then, I'd rebuilt a small life for myself. I worked at a library branch just south of downtown, helped coordinate the community garden on weekends, and occasionally took on freelance analytics work when people remembered I existed. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. And still, even now, the past found a way to knock on the door. It was the night after I got the letter. I was closing up the library when a text came in from an old work number. I didn't recognize it at first. "You should definitely come to the reading." I frowned. Before I could type back, another message came through. "This isn't a PR stunt. She left something. Something Charlotte won't see coming." There was no name, no sign-off. I stared at the screen for a long time, letting the words sink in. I hadn't expected anything. I still didn't. But the fact that someone thought I should be there for a reason beyond formality was enough to twist something tight in my chest. It wasn't about wanting more. It was about being counted. When I got home, I pulled out the folder where I'd kept old ID badges and notes from my time at Moore and Wren. I found one sticky note from Grandma Evelyn with a smiley face next to the words, "Let the data tell the story." I held onto it longer than I meant to. The house creaked under the cold. Outside, a soft frost had started to gather across the grass, turning everything silver and still. I poured myself a mug of peppermint tea and stood by the window. If Charlotte was the face of the company, then maybe I had been the ghost. But ghosts remember things, and sometimes they come back. I took the sticky note and slid it into my coat pocket alongside the letter. I didn't know what would happen in Asheville or what Grandma Evelyn had left behind, but I knew this much. I was showing up, even if nobody had saved me a seat. It was Saturday morning when Charlotte's face showed up in my news feed. I was sitting in a corner booth at Luella's Coffee House, a quiet spot tucked behind a church on South Main, the kind of place where no one looked twice if you stayed an hour with the same cup. The air smelled like cinnamon and citrus, and I was halfway through a blueberry scone when the headline caught my eye. Heir apparent Charlotte Harper carries on the Moore legacy. Below it was a glossy photo of Charlotte seated on a velvet chair in what used to be Grandma Evelyn's sunroom. The photographer had caught her mid-laugh, her hair perfectly waved, her legs crossed just enough to show the red bottoms of her heels. The caption beneath read, "The next generation of Moore and Wren Holdings speaks on legacy leadership and what's next." My stomach nodded before I even clicked the article. She had given an exclusive to Wealthline, a national finance publication. In the interview, Charlotte spoke about being close to Grandma Evelyn, about growing up in the world of business, about learning values like poise under pressure and stewardship of generational wealth. She talked about her plans for the company, about continuing the brand evolution, about honoring Evelyn Moore's vision. I wasn't mentioned. Not once. The last paragraph quoted her directly. "I am honored to continue Grandma Evelyn's legacy and to serve as the future face of Moore and Wren." I didn't realize I had stopped chewing until the scone went dry in my mouth. A few seconds later, another notification popped up. My mother had shared the article on Facebook. The caption read, "So proud of our Charlotte. The future is in the right hands, just like Mom always wanted." I stared at the screen until it blurred. Then I closed the app and locked the phone. The scone sat half-eaten on the plate. I didn't touch it again. Somehow it didn't surprise me. Charlotte had always known how to get in front of a story. That was her skill. She made herself the headline before anyone else even arrived at the table. And people loved it. She was polished, articulate, always camera-ready. She knew how to hold a coffee cup in a way that looked natural in photos. But what gnawed at me more than the performance was the assumption. The complete effortless belief that it was already hers. The inheritance, the legacy, the company, all of it. Like the story had already been written, and I was just some footnote that got edited out. I left the cafe without finishing my drink and walked the long way home, cutting through the neighborhood park where the creek had started to thaw. A group of kids chased each other past the benches, their boots stomping through patches of leftover snow. I kept walking until the cold started to bite through my sleeves. Back at the house, I slipped out of my coat and turned my phone back on. I had 4 unread messages, all from people I hadn't spoken to in months. One was a former coworker from Moore and Wren. "Can you believe this Charlotte thing?" Another from an old college classmate. "Wait, weren't you also working at that company?" I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I opened the letter from Kessler and Bright again and read the line I'd already memorized. "You have been identified as a party with legal interest." That night, just after dinner, my phone rang again. This time it was a number I recognized from the envelope. Kessler and Bright. I picked up. "Delilah Harper?" the voice asked. "Yes," I said, heart suddenly louder in my chest. "This is Daniel Kessler. I'm calling to confirm your attendance for the reading of Evelyn Moore's will on the 24th. I paused. "Yes, I'll be there." There was a brief silence, then a faint sound like paper being shuffled. "Thank you." Mrs. Moore was very specific about who should be notified. She made her updates in person by hand and notarized. Nothing was left unclear. I waited. There was something about his tone that felt unfinished. Mr. Kessler cleared his throat. "I'll say this, Miss Harper. Evelyn planned everything very carefully. And she didn't forget you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything at all. "We look forward to seeing you in Asheville," he said, then ended the call. I stood in the middle of the kitchen with the phone still in my hand. The silence around me felt different. Not empty. More like waiting. Charlotte had written her headline. My mother had shared it like gospel. The world had already applauded. But Grandma Evelyn hadn't spoken yet. And now I had the sense that when she did it wouldn't sound like anything they expected. The chapel in Asheville was built from old stone with arched windows and wood beams that creaked faintly when the wind picked up. It sat on a small rise just off the main road tucked behind a line of bare oak trees that had probably been there longer than the town itself. I arrived 15 minutes early wearing a black wool coat and low-heeled boots that clicked too loudly on the walkway. The air smelled like cold earth and dried pine needles. Inside, the temperature hovered just above warm, the kind of quiet heat that settled into your bones. A man at the door nodded as I entered holding a small clipboard. "Name?" he asked. "Delilah Harper," I said. He glanced at the list, then pointed down a side aisle. "Family sits in the front rows. Everyone else may use the side pews." Everyone else. I made my way down the aisle and found a seat halfway back tucked into the end of the row near the wall. From there, I could see the whole front of the chapel. The urn sat on a pedestal near a framed photograph of Grandma Evelyn taken maybe 20 years ago. She was standing in her old garden, a straw hat tipped back on her head, one hand in a basket of rosemary. Charlotte was already there. She sat in the front row, flanked by my parents, dressed in a sleek black wrap dress that cinched perfectly at her waist. Her hair was styled in soft curls and she wore a pair of heels far too high for the uneven walkway outside. Mom leaned in toward her, whispering something behind a pressed smile. Dad sat on the other side, his face unreadable as usual. No one looked back. No one turned to see if I had arrived. I sat with my coat folded neatly beside me, hands resting in my lap. My heart beat slow and steady, like it was waiting. Not for anything specific, just for the weight of the moment to settle. The rest of the pews filled quickly. A few familiar faces from the company, a couple of Evelyn's old friends from the community board, a woman from her book club who used to bring banana bread every Thursday. At exactly 10 o'clock, Daniel Kessler stepped forward. He was shorter than I remembered, grayer too, but he carried himself with the calm certainty of someone who had seen too many families unravel over too many tables. He wore a dark suit and carried a thin folder in one hand, glasses perched low on his nose. "Thank you all for coming. Today we are gathered to honor the wishes of Evelyn Louise Moore, who passed on the 28th of December 2023. As her longtime attorney, I will now read her last will and testament, executed and notarized on the 3rd of October of that same year." He opened the folder and began. "To my granddaughter Charlotte Elise Harper, I leave the Blue Ridge property and its contents along with $150,000 to be dispersed through the family trust." Charlotte tilted her chin slightly, her expression unreadable. My mother's lips tightened into a smile. Dad blinked slowly, like someone had just confirmed what he already knew. Mr. Kessler continued. "To my daughter Linda Moore Harper, I leave my mother's pearl brooch and a handwritten journal of family recipes." My mother stiffened, then gave a shallow nod, not quite looking at him. There was a long pause, the kind that usually signals the end. I felt the room shift. It was subtle, like a held breath, like everyone silently confirming what they'd expected. That was it. That was all. Then Mr. Kessler turned a page. He adjusted his glasses, and to Delilah June Harper, he paused, a smile flickering across his face. "Oh, this one's good." A few heads turned toward me. Charlotte whipped around, her eyebrows raised. My mother didn't move. Mr. Kessler went on. "To Delilah, I leave controlling interest in Moore and Wren Holdings, comprising 62% of corporate shares, as well as all voting rights, directorial authority, and discretionary control over leadership appointments and structural decisions. I also leave her the sum of $54 million in personal and investment assets, inclusive of real estate equities and cash holdings." The silence that followed was not polite. It was stunned. Charlotte blinked once. Then again. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed without sound. My mother finally turned to look at me. Her expression was frozen somewhere between disbelief and something far colder. My father said nothing. Just exhaled slow and deep. I stayed seated. My hands didn't move, my face didn't change. Inside, my heart beat so loud I could hear it in my ears. Mr. Kessler cleared his throat again. These bequests are to be administered immediately upon completion of probate. A private letter has been provided for Miss Harper, along with documented intent regarding the company's future direction. Charlotte stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. Number. That's not. She looked at Kessler, then at my parents. That's not possible. Grandma never said anything. She didn't even like her. She barely mentioned her. Kessler raised an eyebrow, then closed the folder gently. Evelyn Moore was of sound mind and body. All amendments were witnessed and notarized. There is no ambiguity in her language. Charlotte looked around the room, waiting for someone to support her. No one did. I watched her face, searching for some version of the sister I remembered. But all I saw was the shock of someone who'd never been told no. She turned back to Kessler. There's a mistake. He shook his head once. Number. There isn't. The only sound in the chapel was the distant rustle of someone adjusting their coat. Charlotte's eyes found me, locked onto mine. She didn't speak again. Not yet. She didn't have to. I already knew what was coming. Charlotte's voice sliced through the silence like glass against tile. She was already halfway to the front of the chapel, heels clacking across the floor, her arms stiff at her sides. Her face was flushed and sharp around the edges. That's not right. She didn't know what she was doing. She was confused. Mr. Kessler looked up calmly, resting his hands on the closed folder. Evelyn Moore was not confused, Miss Harper. Charlotte turned to my parents, pleading now. Mom, say something. This isn't legal. Grandma was 80. She didn't even understand the new company structure. Mom didn't respond. Her expression was frozen, unreadable. Not disbelief exactly, not yet. Just controlled disbelief's older, colder cousin. My father cleared his throat but still said nothing. I stayed in my seat still and rooted, as if moving would somehow shift the moment into something else. I watched Charlotte unravel because there was nothing left to hold on to. She looked back at Mr. Kessler, her voice rising. She never told me. She never even mentioned this. Mr. Kessler didn't flinch. That doesn't change what she signed. This is insane, Charlotte said louder now. We were close. I was always there. She would never do this. I saw someone in the second row shift uncomfortably. A woman from the company, maybe. Another rustled a tissue. The room had turned heavy. Not from grief, from discomfort. Charlotte kept going. She had memory problems. Everyone knew it. She said weird things at Thanksgiving. Mr. Kessler raised a hand, then bent to retrieve a slim document from his briefcase. The family should be aware that, before finalizing these updates, Mrs. Moore underwent 2 separate cognitive evaluations. One in August, the second in September. Both confirmed full mental capacity. He handed one copy to a man seated behind the first row, then held the other up. If necessary, I can provide the names and credentials of the neurologists involved. Charlotte stepped back like the paper had burned her. That doesn't mean anything. People can be manipulated. She was vulnerable. Mr. Kessler didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the front row where a younger woman sat, mostly unnoticed until now. She wore a charcoal pantsuit, hair tied in a low bun, quiet but alert. She stood as he nodded toward her. This is Tessa Nguyen. She served as Mrs. Moore's personal assistant during the last 2 years of her life and was present during the drafting of all final documents. She was also a primary witness to the signing of the revised will. Tessa stepped forward with a folder in hand. I was with her for every legal meeting, every medical appointment, and every conversation related to the company. Mrs. Moore made these decisions clearly and deliberately. Her voice was soft but certain. There was no apology in it. Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands were clenched, now fists tight at her sides. Why wouldn't she tell me, she said, but it came out smaller, not to the room, not to Kessler, just into the air. Mr. Kessler took a small breath, then added, Mrs. Moore left a handwritten letter for each of the primary beneficiaries. They will be distributed privately. A few heads turned back toward me. I didn't move. My hands were still folded in my lap. But my fingers had gone numb. This wasn't a fight. It wasn't a negotiation. It was final. Charlotte stepped back toward the pew, blinking fast, her voice cracking just slightly. She should have said something. I think she did, Mr. Kessler said quietly. She just didn't use words. The chapel returned to silence, thick and unmoving. The kind that doesn't lift with air, only with time. Charlotte didn't sit. She stayed standing near the pew, breathing hard, like she was still waiting for someone to interrupt and say it had all been a mistake. No one did. My mother finally spoke, her voice low and sharp. Let's go. Charlotte hesitated but then followed as my parents stood. They walked down the aisle, past the rows of familiar faces, past the urn, past me. My father didn't look in my direction. My mother's chin was high, eyes forward, like she was walking out of a courtroom, not a chapel. Only Charlotte looked at me. Not anger. Not shock. Just disbelief. The door clicked closed behind them. The rest of the room stayed seated, unsure of what to do next. Mr. Kessler cleared his throat, back to business. There will be a short reception downstairs for those who wish to share memories or condolences. For those involved in the administration process, documentation and instructions will be mailed in the coming days. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff. The world hadn't tilted, but it felt unfamiliar. Like someone had taken the floor I thought I knew and stripped it down to raw wood. Tessa caught my eye as she walked past, giving me a short nod. Congratulations isn't the right word, she said quietly. But she was certain. I managed a nod in return, but no words. Instead, I walked to the front of the room and stopped beside the photo of Grandma Evelyn. The one from her garden. Her smile was soft, not camera-ready, just real. Her hands were dirty from potting soil, sleeves rolled back. No pearls, no podium. Just her. I looked at her and finally let my breath go. Thank you, I thought. Then I turned and walked down the aisle, this time not trying to disappear. The drive back to the house felt longer than usual, though the roads were quiet and the sky was a soft gray, the kind that never quite decides whether to rain. I didn't turn on the radio. I let the silence press against the windows and stayed with it 1 mile at a time. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light flickered like it always did. The bricks beneath the steps had shifted slightly since the last winter. I didn't go inside right away. I walked to the mailbox, still slightly tilted, the paint on the flag chipped. Inside was a single envelope. Cream-colored, thick, with my name in her handwriting. No return address. No decoration, just Delilah. I carried it in like it was glass. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and lemon oil. The same way it always had after she cleaned the kitchen on Sunday afternoons. I sat at the dining table and held the envelope in both hands, running my fingers over the loops of the D. I opened it carefully, unfolding the page once, then again. Her handwriting was strong. No shakiness, no hesitation. You never had to try to prove yourself to me, it read. And that's exactly why you were the one who deserved to be trusted. I felt something shift in my chest, like a string I hadn't noticed was pulled too tight had finally loosened. I kept reading. They all wanted to be seen. You just showed up. And you always stayed. I closed my eyes, letting the words settle like dust on wood. Then I stood and walked to the living room, where the bookshelf still leaned ever so slightly to the left. I reached behind the row of gardening manuals and pulled out the small green journal I knew would be there. Her garden journal. She used to carry it out with her in the afternoons, scribbling in it between watering rows of basil and tying back her dahlias. I opened to the back pages. They're scrawled in pen that had bled just slightly from heat or time, were lines I had never seen. Charlotte loves the spotlight. Delilah knows how to keep the fire lit. It didn't read like judgment. Just observation. Sharp and soft at once. I thought of that day 2 summers ago when she fell near the rose trellis. I had just arrived with groceries when I found her on the ground. One hand scraped, the other clutching her hip. I stayed with her all week. We moved a cot into the living room so she wouldn't have to climb stairs. I cooked soft meals and rubbed ointment into her bruised shoulder. We watched old baking shows and reruns of Jeopardy until she fell asleep. Charlotte called once 5 minutes into the second afternoon. She kept the camera angled just right, lighting good voice, sweet. Grandma smile. I want to post a little story. Just say you're okay. Evelyn gave a tired smile, not fake, just resigned. The video ended quickly and Charlotte didn't call again that week. I never mentioned it. That night, Evelyn and I had made peppermint tea. She poured mine without asking, just like she always did, and said softly as we sipped, "Being seen isn't the same as being known, you know." Now I could almost hear her saying it again as I flipped through the last pages of her journal. There were more notes, most of them gardening tips or seed orders. But then a small fold-out page fell from the back. I picked it up. A rough sketch of the property drawn in her neat lines. On the right corner in red ink she'd written greenhouse expansion. Below that in smaller print, for Delilah if she ever wants it. I blinked back, something tight behind my eyes. I didn't come here to be given anything. But this was not a gift made for flash. It was practical, quiet, intentional. I placed the note back into the journal, then set it beside me on the arm of the chair. I didn't need to go digging through the rest of the house tonight. I just sat there in the room she'd loved, where the light hit the walls a certain way after 4 p.m., and let myself feel full. Not rich. Just rooted. The headline hit mid-morning, flashing across my phone screen while I was wiping down the old kitchen counters. Wealthline had issued a formal correction. Charlotte Moore was not the primary heir to Evelyn Moore's estate. The article used words like misrepresentation and premature announcement. The photo they ran was the same one she had used in her original press tour, but now it looked strangely hollow, a spotlight without a subject. By noon, 3 more outlets had picked up the correction. 2 ran side-by-side comparisons of the original cover and the revised headline. Another included a quote from an anonymous source inside Moore and Wren Holdings, who described the situation as a clear case of self-branding gone wrong. Comment sections lit up like a match to dry brush. I didn't feel triumphant, just tired. The doorbell rang around 2. I opened it to find my mother standing on the porch, arms crossed, jaw set. Behind her, Charlotte sat slouched in the back seat of her car, sunglasses too large for the overcast day, her face blotchy beneath them. My mother didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped past me like it was still her house. "You've made this family a laughingstock," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. Her coat was buttoned too tight, and her earrings shook when she moved. Charlotte told the press what she believed was true. "You let her humiliate herself." I closed the door behind them quietly. Charlotte didn't move from the couch. She had taken off her sunglasses and now wiped her eyes with the back of her hand like a child being scolded at school. "She told them because she wanted the story out first," I said. "That wasn't about Grandma's legacy. That was about control." "She's devastated," my mother snapped. "And the board is in chaos." "Do you have any idea what you've stirred up?" I didn't reply right away. The way she said "you stirred up" made it sound like I'd broken something precious instead of receiving something that had always quietly belonged to me. Charlotte spoke finally. Her voice was rough, thin. "You didn't even want the company. You left. You let it go." I walked over slowly, not close but close enough, and maybe that's exactly why Grandma trusted me with it. Because I didn't want to wear it like a crown. She looked up sharply, eyes narrowing, but there was something unsure behind her glare. Not anger. Uncertainty. "I gave up everything for that company," she said. "The photo shoots, the press, the events, I built that image." "You built an image," I agreed. "But Grandma built the company." My mother looked between us, her face unreadable now. I could see the hairline fractures forming in the way she stood, like the pressure was beginning to collapse the performance. She said, "This should have been Charlotte's. Evelyn knew how hard she worked." And yet, I said calmly, she still made her choice. Charlotte stood up, suddenly brushing her hands down the front of her blazer. "Then I'll fight it. I'll challenge the will." "You can try," I said. "You'll hear from my attorney." That's when the doorbell rang again. It was a courier. A man in a navy jacket handed me a sealed envelope and asked for a signature. I signed without speaking and closed the door softly. Inside was a document from Kessler and Bright. A legal notice outlining the validity of Evelyn Moore's will the notarized statement video evidence of the signing and declarations from two independent mental health professionals, affirming her full cognitive capacity at the time of the radio amendment. I handed the envelope to my mother. She opened it slowly, reading the first page, then the second. Charlotte leaned in behind her, mouth tightening with every line. "There's nothing to fight," I said quietly. "Grandma made this decision freely and with care. She left a video. There's a date stamp. Witnesses. A certified notary. It won't be overturned." Charlotte stepped back, her voice thin again. "You're just enjoying this, aren't you?" "No," I said. "I'm trying to make sense of it just like you are. But I won't apologize for not walking away from what she trusted me with." My mother looked like she wanted to say something else, but the words never came. She placed the documents back in the envelope and set it down on the entryway table like it was something that might explode. Charlotte didn't say goodbye when she left. She walked past me stiffly and got into the car without looking back. My mother followed, pausing only briefly at the threshold. She stared at me with eyes I couldn't read. Then she said, "It still should have been her." Then she closed the door and they drove off, leaving the gravel unsettled in their wake. I stood there for a long moment, watching the dust settle around the mailbox. That night, I didn't scroll headlines. I didn't check the company's boardroom feeds or the financial blogs. I made tea, sat by the window, and opened my grandmother's journal again. Near the middle was a half-torn page I hadn't seen before. It read, "The world will always chase the girl in the spotlight. But it will need the one who keeps the lights on when everyone else has gone home." I ran my fingers over the ink. Then I closed the book and let the quiet return. The meeting room smelled like oak and fresh coffee, and for a moment it reminded me of late mornings in Grandma Evelyn's kitchen, where the scent of cinnamon always lingered longer than it should. I hadn't stepped foot in the Moore and Wren boardroom in nearly 5 years, not since Charlotte took over the public face of the company, and I quietly exited through a side door unnoticed. But now the brass plaque outside the door bore my name. Acting CEO. The long table was already half filled when I walked in. Men in tailored suits, a few familiar faces, a few new. I wore a navy sheath dress and a black cardigan, not the kind of power outfit Charlotte would have picked, but I wasn't here for optics. I was here because Evelyn Moore had trusted me with the legacy she built. And it was time they all knew why. David Marks, the oldest member of the board and arguably the most difficult to impress, cleared his throat as I took my seat at the head of the table. "We appreciate your presence today, Miss Harper. Given the recent changes, we thought it best to hear your intentions for Moore and Wren directly." I nodded politely. I expected no less. Before I could open my folder, he added with a smile too stiff to be kind, "I assume you're aware this board is composed of individuals with decades of operational and investment experience. That kind of leadership background isn't typically built in garden sheds or, say, family kitchens." A few people chuckled, some glanced down. Others waited for my response like it was a tennis match. I met his gaze. "My grandmother and I spent a lot of time in that kitchen, actually. It's where we reviewed cash flow models and product pipeline forecasts. Maybe unconventional, but very thorough." The room quieted. I opened the folder in front of me and slid a copy of the business strategy across the table to David. "This is a 3-year adaptive growth plan. Evelyn and I worked on it over the past 6 months. It includes quarterly innovation sprints, divestment from low-yield assets, and an expansion strategy for our southern real estate portfolio. Page 15 outlines board realignment suggestions." She signed every page. David blinked. Another board member, a woman named Sharon Lynn from marketing, leaned forward to skim the headers. Her brows lifted. "You helped her write this?" "No," I said. "She helped me write it." Silence followed. The kind of silence that felt both skeptical and slightly curious. "She didn't believe in putting people in positions just because they were loud," I added. "She believed in choosing the one who would protect the flame, not chase the spotlight." That got their attention. Sharon flipped a few more pages. "This includes projected ROI on the multi-use projects." "Yes," I said. "With breakdowns by quarter and a risk analysis based on post-pandemic consumer trends." David sat back in his chair. A slow, measured breath escaped him. Your grandmother didn't mention this plan to anyone. That was the point. She wanted it ready when it mattered. And now it does. Another board member, a former CFO named Joseph Kent, tapped his pen against the table. Look, no offense, Miss Harper, but this room has seen more power plays in 1/4 than some people see in a lifetime. What makes you think you're ready to manage a company valued at nearly $300 million? I didn't flinch. Because I've spent years studying how power is used badly. How it's handed out based on charisma instead of competence. I don't care about being adored, I care about the company surviving the next 10 years. And Evelyn believed that mattered more than appearances. I paused, then added. She said the person who knows when to be quiet is the same person who knows exactly when to act. A stillness settled in again. This time different. Joseph looked at David, then at Sharon. Nobody spoke. Finally, Sharon smiled slightly and said, I think she just answered your question. Mr. Kessler, who had remained at the side of the room until now, stepped forward. If there are no objections, I'll submit this plan as the official operational blueprint endorsed by the late Ms. Evelyn Moore and presented by her legal successor Delilah Harper. No one objected. Not out loud. But I saw the doubt lingering in their expressions, and I didn't blame them. They'd seen boardrooms turned into battlefields. I wasn't naive. I knew there were members who had already aligned themselves with Charlotte, thinking she'd inherit the reins. This would take more than one meeting to change. But it was a start. After the session adjourned, Sharon pulled me aside as the others filed out. You surprised them. Did I? She smiled. Most people who show up to board meetings with something to prove end up proving all the wrong things. You didn't come in swinging. You came in prepared. I nodded, unsure whether it was a compliment or a warning. As she walked away, I glanced back at the room. The chairs were still warm. The table held fingerprints and coffee rings and the quiet weight of 1,000 decisions made before I ever sat there. And now, for better or worse, it was mine. I took the plan, tucked it under my arm, and walked out. In the hallway, I passed a familiar face, Tessa Nguyen, Grandma Evelyn's longtime assistant. She gave me a small nod. She'd be proud, she said. I know. But more importantly, Tessa added, you should be proud too. I didn't reply right away. I just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, not fast, not hesitant, just steady. On Sunday morning, I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house in North Asheville. The same 2-story home with faded shutters and the creaking porch swing that I had known since childhood. The same one I used to stare at from the school bus window, wishing I could slip inside unnoticed and disappear into my room. I wasn't sure why I came. Maybe it was the way Grandma Evelyn's words had settled into my chest, a slow-burning clarity. Or maybe I just needed to hear it said out loud, whatever it was that had stood between me and my mother for all these years. The door opened before I could knock. Linda Harper stood in the doorway wearing her usual pressed blouse and lipstick too bright for morning light. Her expression was unreadable. Not angry, not welcoming, just composed. The way she always was when she didn't want anyone to see the cracks. She stepped aside without a word, and I walked past her into the house. The smell of lemon polish hit me first, then the faint scent of the gardenias she always kept in a bowl on the table. I sat down in the living room where everything was as it had been since I was 12. Same floral couch, same landscape painting over the fireplace. Same sense that this house belonged to a version of our family that had never really existed. She sat across from me, crossed one leg over the other, and folded her hands in her lap. So, you've made quite the impression, she said. I stayed quiet. Charlotte's been devastated, you know. Humiliated. She had plans. People were watching. I looked at her. Her voice hadn't cracked once. She sounded more inconvenienced than heartbroken. You mean she made herself the center of attention and didn't like the outcome, I said. Her lips tightened. You've always been sharp, Delilah. Always knew how to twist a phrase. But Evelyn, she always favored you. No matter what Charlotte did. That woman never saw how hard Charlotte worked for this family. She didn't need to see it, I said. Charlotte made sure everyone else did. Linda's eyes narrowed. You think this is all about vanity number? I think Charlotte spent her whole life trying to prove she was worthy. But somewhere along the way she forgot who she was proving it to. She scoffed. And you? What did you ever try to prove? I leaned forward. I tried to prove I could be useful without being visible. I tried to make space for people who never made any for me. Her hands tensed slightly. She didn't speak for a while. Then she said Evelyn was difficult. She didn't know how to raise girls who didn't mirror her. She gave you this power, this position, but that doesn't make it right. You told me once that I wasn't like you, I said. That I wasn't soft enough, polished enough. That I didn't know how to please people. She looked away. I used to think that meant I was broken. But now, I think I'm grateful. Linda's eyes flicked back to mine. There was something in them, something that almost resembled recognition, but it passed too fast to hold. Before she could respond, the front door opened again. My father walked in, a man who had spent his life navigating the space between two strong-willed women. His gray cardigan hung loose over his shoulders, and he looked more tired than I remembered. "Hey kiddo," he said softly. I stood up and hugged him, surprised by how steady he felt. He glanced between us, then pulled something from the pocket of his coat. "This came the day after Evelyn passed," he said. "She asked me not to open it until now." He handed me a small envelope. My name wasn't on it. His was. Ron Harper. I looked at him. "She said if anything ever happened I should give it to you." I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of cream stationery written in her slanted, sharp cursive. "If I'm no longer here, remind Ron that Delilah is the light that doesn't need a stage. The one who always saw what needed to be done, not just what needed to be seen." My breath caught. Dad looked away, blinking hard. "Your grandmother. She saw things I didn't." I folded the letter carefully and held it in my hands. "Thank you," I said. Linda rose slowly, walking toward the window. Her back was to me now. She didn't speak. I stepped toward the door. "Tell Charlotte I don't hate her," I said quietly. "But I won't apologize for accepting what was given freely." I didn't expect a response, and none came. Outside, the wind had picked up. The gardenias on the front step had started to wilt, but their scent was still strong, lingering in the air like something that refused to be forgotten. I walked to my car without looking back. The morning after I visited my parents, I arrived at Moore and Wren before anyone else. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, and the parking lot was empty, except for Tessa's car. I took the elevator to the executive floor, stepped into my office, and stood there for a long moment staring out at the skyline. The board had given me their hesitant green light, but I knew better than to think the hard part was over. Evelyn had trusted me with the reins, but that didn't mean everyone else had. Still, I had something more solid than approval. I had a purpose. By 9 a.m., Tessa was at my door with coffee and a folder labeled Communications Restructure. I had asked her to gather everything Charlotte had greenlit in the last 6 months under the branding initiative. Press releases, social partnerships, influencer deals, things that looked good on the surface but didn't always align with what the company stood for. We spread the documents across the conference table. I saw slogans that read "Reinventing Heritage," "Reframing Legacy," and other empty buzzwords. It was all flash, no core. "We need to pull these from the website," I said, marking a list with red ink. "And cancel the PR contract with Fenwick and Vale. Their image first, ethics last." Tessa nodded, scribbling notes. "What about the mid-quarter campaign rollout?" she asked. "They booked it through March. We'll eat the penalty fee. It's worth it." By mid-morning, I'd called an emergency meeting with the internal communications team. I walked them through my revised messaging plan. Real stories. Real people. Legacy not as aesthetic, but as accountability. No one clapped, but a few heads nodded. That was enough for now. The harder part came after lunch. David Marks showed up at my office with a portfolio and that same polished smile I'd seen in the boardroom. "I have something you'll want to see," he said. I gestured for him to sit. He opened the folder and slid a contract across the desk. "Expansion into private correctional facilities," he said. "Long-term leasing and infrastructure investment. The margins are incredible." Evelyn sat on this proposal for 2 years. I think now's the time. I skimmed the first few pages. It was all there. The money, the projections, the ethical sinkhole. This isn't happening, I said. David blinked. It's legal. So is payday lending, I said. Doesn't make it right. He leaned forward. Delilah, you've just taken over a multi-billion-dollar company. You don't get to play idealist. You play to win. I closed the folder. Evelyn didn't leave me this company so I could win. She left it to me so I wouldn't lose what matters. He didn't speak for a few seconds. Then he stood. You'll regret passing on this. I didn't answer. By the time he left, my hands were shaking, but only slightly. I poured myself a glass of water and stared out the window until my breath slowed. Later that afternoon, I drafted the internal newsletter. It was my first official communication as acting CEO. I kept it short, just 2 paragraphs. No photo, no signature banner. Moore and Wren will move forward with full transparency. Decisions will be measured not only by financial return but by the integrity of their impact. No employee will be pushed aside for not fitting an image. We are not here to perform legacy. We are here to live it. I hit send. An hour later my inbox pinged. Then again. Then again. Some were short. Thank you for saying what needed to be said. Others longer. I left 3 years ago because I never felt seen. I'd like to come back if there's a place for someone who cares about substance more than show. I read everyone. At the end of the day, I walked back into the conference room where we'd laid out the campaign papers that morning. Tessa was still there organizing the folders. That was brave, she said without looking up. Number. That was overdue. She smiled. You know, Evelyn said something to me once after Charlotte had just finished another photo shoot for the magazine. What was it? She said Charlotte photographs well. But Delilah, she shows up. I didn't say anything. I just stood there letting the truth of it settle somewhere deep and quiet. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to validate the path. I was walking it, and I was still standing. The invitation to speak at the Women in Leadership Southeast Conference had arrived a few weeks ago in an email I almost deleted. At the time, I didn't think much of it. There were plenty of more polished candidates, ones with clearer resumes, shinier portfolios, bigger social followings. I wasn't used to being the one at the podium. I was used to watching from the back row, silently measuring the room while someone else spoke. But when I mentioned the invitation to Tessa, she looked up from her laptop and said, without hesitation, "You're doing it. No more letting other people narrate your story." So here I was standing behind the podium at the Charlotte Convention Center, my palms cool against the acrylic sides, a quiet hum of conversations dying down as I stepped into the spotlight. The ballroom was larger than I'd expected, rows upon rows of women, seated in neat lines, some with notebooks already open, others holding coffee cups or looking at the stage with a kind of nervous hope I recognized instantly. My name was printed on the program last in the keynote lineup. Delilah Harper, CEO of Moore and Wren Holdings. I let the silence stretch just a little, grounding myself before I spoke. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who stood up here, I said. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because for a long time I thought my value depended on being seen by the right people in the right way. And when I wasn't, I disappeared. A few heads nodded. In the front row, a woman maybe in her early 60s folded her arms, watching closely. But I didn't stop showing up. Even when I wasn't included in meetings, even when my contributions were reframed or dismissed, even when people told me I wasn't the right fit for the image they wanted, I stayed. Quietly, steadily. And eventually I realized that staying power is a kind of leadership too. I talked about the night I stayed at the hospital with my grandmother when she fell and how no one else from the family came. I told them about walking away from Moore and Wren when the noise got too loud and returning only when I knew I could carry the weight with clarity. I spoke about silence not as surrender but as strategy. I'm not the most charismatic person. I don't have the sharpest suits or the most followers online. I'm not always confident. But I am consistent. I show up. And sometimes that's what matters most. When I stepped back from the mic, the room stayed quiet for a heartbeat. Then the applause started, small but sure, and then it built until it filled the space like sunlight after a storm. Some women stood, others wiped away tears. And for once I let myself feel all of it. Not pride exactly, but something more grounded. A sense that I'd cracked something open that needed air. Later that night, I sat on the hotel balcony, still in my conference heels, my blazer draped over the chair, watching the streetlights flicker in the soft spring dusk. My phone buzzed constantly. The clip of my speech had made its way onto every platform: LinkedIn, Instagram, even TikTok. The comments came in by the hundreds. You just told my story. I thought I was invisible until now. Thank you for reminding me that quiet doesn't mean weak. By morning, my inbox held over 24 messages from women across the country. A principal in Texas. A postal worker in Ohio. A small business owner in Seattle. All of them had stories. All of them had stayed silent. Until now. Back at the office that Monday, I walked through the lobby and caught unfamiliar eyes smiling at me. A junior designer I'd never spoken to handed me a sticky note on my desk. We've never met, but thank you for what you said. You made me stay. I kept that note tucked into my planner. Midweek, David Marks stopped by unannounced. His tone was markedly different from the last time we spoke. You made an impression, he said. I didn't bother to ask where. He meant everywhere. The board's watching. They're talking about succession planning, next year's vote, and a possible new chair. He paused, waiting for my reaction. I just raised an eyebrow. Delilah, this could be your seat. You could lead not just the company, but the board. Full direction. I leaned back in my chair, hands folded in my lap. I didn't come here to sit at the top, David. I came to build a table where more people could sit. You don't have to choose, he said. You can do both. I smiled. That's what you do, but I'm not here to be a symbol. I'm here to work. He nodded slowly, then stood. You're surprising, Delilah. I hear that a lot, I said. That evening, Tessa and I went over the next quarter's strategy in the conference room. We drank tea from mismatched mugs and scratched notes on a whiteboard we'd forgotten to erase since February. When we wrapped, she looked at me and said, You know, it's kind of poetic. They never planned for you to lead, and now they can't stop asking you to. I shrugged. I never needed them to ask. I just needed to stop asking myself for permission. We walked out of the building together. The city air was warm. Somewhere nearby, a saxophone played from a street corner. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to walk quickly or prove anything to anyone. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The house in Asheville had stayed mostly untouched. The ivy still crept around the porch columns. The front steps still creaked in the same spot when I stepped on them. But the light inside was different now. Softer. Like it had finally settled after too many years of tiptoeing around grief. I came alone, no announcement, no reporters, no business meetings, just me and the key she'd left in the side drawer. In the living room by the east-facing window, I hung the framed photo I'd kept boxed for years. It was the garden. Not posed, not edited. Just the two of us sitting in silence. Her in that wide straw hat she wore when pruning me with dirt on my jeans and a trowel resting on my knee. Neither of us looking at the camera. Just looking at each other. The glass on the frame caught the morning sun. For a moment, the entire room glowed like a memory made visible. I made tea. Not the kind from a cafe or a corporate kitchenette, but real tea. Peach blossom, just like the one we used to brew on lazy Sunday afternoons. The kettle let out a low whistle and I poured it into the old ceramic teapot she'd kept on the windowsill. The one shaped like a cat, chipped slightly at the spout. I set everything on the table. One cup. One journal. It wasn't fancy. Just a blue spiral-bound notebook with her name written on the inside cover. I had found it tucked in the bottom of her drawer beneath scarves and old receipts and that tiny pressed flower she always swore was from her first date with Grandpa. I hadn't opened it until today. I flipped to the first blank page and picked up the pen. No loud noise ever changed the world. Only the quiet insistence of someone willing to stay, I wrote. I let the sentence sit. I didn't rush it. Outside, the wind stirred the garden beds. The daffodils were coming up early this year. I'd have to mulch again. I made a note of it in the margins. By mid-afternoon, I was on my knees near the stone path, gloves on, trimming back the frostbitten leaves. The same way I used to when I was 12 and didn't know what grief was, only that silence in a garden felt better than noise in the house. The neighbors waved. Some recognized me. Others looked unsure, like they'd seen me on a screen but couldn't quite place the name. I smiled, waved back, then returned to pruning. There was still work to do. Later that evening, as the sky turned orange behind the mountains, I sat back at the kitchen table, one hand around the teacup, the other resting on the windowsill. I thought of everything that had happened. The boardrooms, the headlines, Charlotte's accusations, my mother's silence. It was all still there. But now it had its place. It didn't follow me like a shadow anymore. On the shelf behind me was the box of clippings from her life. Business cards from Moore and Wren's earliest contracts. Photos of her cutting a ribbon in front of the first office building. Letters she never sent. Among them, a slip of paper with just one line written in her sharp looping script. Delilah is the light that doesn't ask for a switch. I folded the paper and slid it into the front of the notebook. This wasn't a fairy tale. There were no apologies wrapped in ribbons, no sudden transformations. My mother hadn't called, Charlotte hadn't changed. But I had. And maybe that was the only story that needed to be told. I didn't inherit Moore and Wren because I was louder or flashier or more ambitious. I inherited it because I stayed. I stayed when it was uncomfortable. I stayed when I wasn't invited. I stayed even when I wasn't sure why I was still trying. I didn't come back for the spotlight. I came back to preserve what everyone else had forgotten. The story isn't always about the person who gets the most attention. Sometimes it's about the one who keeps the lights on when the stage is empty. And now, if you've ever felt like the background character in your own life, like the quiet one no one noticed until the very end, I hope you'll stay too. I hope you'll leave a comment, share your story, and maybe even subscribe if this one reminded you that your voice matters even when the room is silent. I'll be here, in the garden, in the stillness, holding the light steady until you're ready to speak.